So we're going to have a panel, and the panel is going to be moderated. So let me introduce you to the people who are going to be speaking. The first is George Friday. She's getting her stuff together here. George is a field coordinator for the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. She has spent her career working to bring civil rights and protect civil rights in the United States for anybody who seems to have those rights violated. Ben Manski is the founder of the Liberty Tree Foundation for the Democratic Revolution, and I think we're ready for a democratic revolution. Yeah. Max Rameau is a organizer who started the Take Back the Land movement. And Take Back the Land is a movement that is working not only to end foreclosures, either by preventing them from happening or actually adversely occupying homes that had previously become empty, but on a much deeper level, moving towards new conceptions of how property should be conceived, not either private or public, but community property in the sense of community trusts. So, Max, we're happy to have you here. And our moderator tonight is going to be Caitlin Saposi Belknap. And if you don't know Caitlin, she's the executive director of the Democracy Unlimited. She is one of the co-founders for Move to Amend. She's the national field organizer for the Move to Amend campaign. And I have to say, I think she's doing an incredible job. The Move to Amend campaign has taken off like wildfire, and it's largely due to her and the organizing at that central office down in California. So, Caitlin. With that said, I'm actually going to turn this mic over to Caitlin, and she's going to begin the moderating of the panel for this evening. So, Caitlin?
Do you want me to go up there?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Do you want me to move slide down? You good? Hi, everybody. I actually just found out they just decided that I would moderate them like an hour ago. That's okay, because like Stan said, I helped organize this conference, so I know what they're supposed to talk about, which is just as well to be the moderator. And I also just have to say that Stan, this will be, at the end, I'll get to be on the panel with everybody, and we'll do it again. But Stan and Ruth and the folks here at Lane and Eugene have just done an awesome job, and it's really exciting that Move to Amend's first convergence for the year is here, and we couldn't have better hosts. So thank you so much for all the work that you've done. And also, thank you for the sunshine, because they were complaining about the weather here last night, and I'm sorry, but the only place that has worse weather than Eugene is Humboldt County, California, where we're on the ocean, and it's freezing, so thank you for some sunshine. So the purpose of the panel tonight was to kind of set the stage, as tomorrow we learn about how we can get involved in our communities, whether they're this community here or whether we're going off back home, how we can get involved in what we can do and deepen our organizing skills especially and our analysis. But tonight we wanted to start off by setting the foundation and putting ourselves in the context of not just what's going on around this country, but what's happening all over the world. I only heard a tiny little bit of today, but I happened to come in right as David was talking about how there is a global democracy movement, and we really want to be intentional about identifying ourselves as part of that, and we are part of that. And so I'm really excited to have my longtime colleagues of George and Ben on this panel to frame it out, and brand new colleague, and I'm sure comrade in the years to come, Max, to frame that out for us. So what I'm going to do is actually just ask them some questions, and they're each going to take a stab at answering them, and hopefully that'll be a good foundation for us to go into a really full day tomorrow of figuring out how to really take this analysis and foundation and turn it into action at home, or deepen the action that we're already doing. So let's start with something uplifting. I'd love to hear from each of you about what is the most exciting example that you want to speak of of the U.S. Or of the democracy movement. And it'd be great if between the three of you, you could think of trying to cover globally, in the U.S., at maybe a state level and locally. So you each don't have to do each one of those, but if we haven't hit kind of all the different areas, then maybe we'll cycle through again. So let's just start off with one thing that inspires you about what's happening with the democracy movement. And you remember that you have to pass the mic. You want to start, Max, maybe? Otherwise, you all will just look at each other for like 5 minutes.
First of all, thank you for having me here. I appreciate the invitation, and I thank everyone for coming. I think we are in some really exciting times right now in history, and this is just a major shift in where we are from where we were just even a few years ago. I don't want to spend too much time on that now, but in terms of what is exciting and inspiring, I'm really inspired by some organizations who have been doing a particular kind of work for years and decades, and sometimes even centuries. And just now, we're beginning to recognize and validate some of their work by us, not only in the world, but particularly in the United States, following in their footsteps. So Take Back the Land was modeled off of really three organizations. One is an organization named Abagali Besamjolo, which is out of South Africa, one of the largest land reform movements in the United States. I'm sorry, in the world. And then another one, which is a smaller one, but also in South Africa, Western Cape Anti-Eviction Campaign, where they engage in anti-eviction work. And their jobs, as they see it, is to ensure zero evictions in their communities. And they physically blockade evictions, and it's just an amazing thing to watch. And of course, we're also modeled after the MST, Landless People's Movement in Brazil. And I had the pleasure of going to South Africa a couple of years ago and meeting with some of the folks from Abagali and from the Western Cape. And when I was with the organization at the Western Cape, they have a very, very small organizing crew. And they go to communities, and the communities that say, we're interested in doing eviction defenses over here. And Abagali does this in a particular way. I saw it at play at the Western Cape, though. But Abagali, if you want to become like a chapter of Abagali in South Africa, you go to them and say, look, we are interested in becoming a chapter, we want to do it. And they go and they do an orientation in your community. And then they give you sign-in sheets, and they say, call us when you have 50 of your neighbors organized, and we'll be back when you're. And they compel the people in the neighborhoods to organize themselves. They don't come and organize communities. Communities organize themselves, and they help out in that way. And I think that's an amazing, and we saw it at play in the Western Cape, where they do something very similar. We were going around with them, and there was actually an eviction defense taking place that morning. And we were late to the eviction defense. We're late with the main organizer because we were trying to see all kinds of things. So first of all, I was really fretting about how we're showing up an hour late for an eviction defense. We get there, there's 300 people outside of the house that is scheduled for eviction. And I'm just totally in shock. And they're not waiting for the organizer. They're not sitting in the house waiting for, they're making things move. And I'm there, I'm like, wow, I can't believe you guys have 300 people. And the organizer was, and they said, no, this is the watch group. Everyone here has a 5-person phone tree. As soon as the police calls, everyone takes out their cell phones and they call. There will be 12 to 1,500 people here when the police show. And this was several years ago. This was way before Occupy. This is since it's Take Back. And they've been doing this work for years. And the MST has been doing this work for years. And just now, we here are catching up to what they have been doing over there. And I've been inspired by that work, and I'm continuing to be inspired by that work.
Thank you for going first. That was an excellent way to start. So I came of age in 1992. Bill Clinton made it through the Democratic primaries. I left the Democratic Party. We had this little thing called NAFTA. We had the declaration of the Lacundan Jungle, Chiapas, which inspired a lot of folks in the U.S. and throughout North America. And for me, as a person in my 20s who was involved with radical movements, I found it very irritating the way that people who came out of the 60s and 70s would talk to us. And sometimes I still do, to be honest with you, but I get less of it. You know, the students aren't doing anything anymore. The young people aren't doing anything more. Where are they? And I was thinking, boy, we were blockading that logging road. Where were you? We were taking over the Exxon offices. Where were you? We occupied the state capitol building. Where were you? We shut down the World Trade Organization. Some of you were there. That's good. I like that. You know, and I think eventually my generation, Generation X, earned some cred. I think there's a lot of things that went on with my generation that most people will never know because it wasn't as well documented. And then we entered a period which was the Bush era. And I began to be one of those people who was a little bit older, who was working with mentoring younger folks. And I started wondering, what the heck is going on? What's going on with these young people? Where are they? You know, we have the anti-war demonstrations, United for Peace and Justice, and it's like, you know, we did it. We had the Books Not Bombs student strike in 2003, I think that was. Probably most of you never heard about that, but the hundreds and hundreds of cities around the country, students walked out of high schools, middle schools, and colleges. We organized that. That was good. But then it seemed to me there was this down period, you know. And I will acknowledge that I don't have perfect information, as much attention as I was paying to the younger generation. But what I will tell you is that what is most exciting to me is that I have noticed that young people are in the lead again in a very big way all over the world. And now I can be... The other thing that used to irritate me, you know, was like there was a no-win for the 60s generation. You either complimented us or you dissed us, right? I hated getting patted on the head, too. Well, now I have to watch out for that. But I have to tell you, you know, not only in Wisconsin where you saw that it was high school students who marched out of classes, and my students at Madison College, I teach at our community college, and students at UW-Madison who occupied the Capitol, and then the labor movement followed them, right? Not only have I seen it firsthand where a young man who volunteered on my campaign, I ran for state assembly a year and a half ago. Great campaign, lots of fun. He was just elected to the county board, right? A really radical guy, Leland Pan. I have a lot of people I'm inspired by who are in their early 20s and late teens right now. But I saw it in the streets of London. You know, I was on my way to a conference. They were flying me out there, and I happened to be in London on the way. I had a day there. And there's student strikes, hundreds of thousands of students in the streets of London, young people, all races, coming from all class backgrounds, with maybe the exception of a few of the aristos. You know, but out there confronting the police. And you see it in Chile, and you see it in Tel Aviv, and you saw it in Tunisia, and you see it in Cairo. So that's the thing that I find most exciting is this generational awakening, which, I mean, look, my generation, we're indebted, and we're indentured. But the younger generation hasn't even had that opportunity. So you better fight back.
All right. So there's more than one thing I'm excited about, especially at a local level. A lot of that inspiration comes from my work with the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, because we do help local cities and counties to pass laws and ordinances that restrict the local law enforcement from doing the work of the federal government, DHS, ICE, or the FBI. So what that looks like, though, is different everywhere. So our model, we have a model legislation that is the model for everywhere, but then how it takes form is different and very exciting. And also what I've been excited about at the local level are things you might do. For instance, in Asheville, North Carolina, and you actually reminded me of this, Max, when you talked about the folks who are the watchers. There are checkpoints that happen often for people looking for people who are not documented. And there are places where there's only one way in and one way out of like these trailer parks or whatever. So if you're going to drop your kids off and you're going to go to work, you've got to go this way. So the police set a checkpoint out at these places, often with low-income people, African-American and undocumented people, some documented people, but immigrant folks, Polish, and people from Mexico and El Salvador, other places. What happens now when there's a checkpoint is there is a cell phone phone tree. And tons of people come out and just witness. And I've got a chance to do this sometimes. So, you know, it's late at night. They're doing the state patrolmen or the sheriffs have come to check people's ID and check their license. And there's also those of us just standing there witnessing, just kind of watching, just hanging out. But what's really great is there are also signs that say we see you and we're here and we support you, because it's really scary for people to do that. And for people who are a little less than conventional, they might be going a few cars back and seeing if they can walk people out who don't need to be there, right? And taking them around a corner and giving them a ride where they need to go? Yes, that's right. So being creative about doing that, I think, is fantastic. In Los Angeles, there's a great young organization led by young people called the Youth Justice Coalition. They are in the midst of a fantastic democracy campaign of challenging building a new prison, like no new jail. They're doing great work with that in coalition with lots of different kinds of partners because they had the brilliant idea of challenging how LA is choosing to spend public funds to build a new prison, given the conditions of that city, especially in South Central where they are. And they made a demand that each of y'all could demand of your budget in wherever you live. And earlier David talked about people's budgets, but they've demanded that 1% of the budget for LA prisons and LA law enforcement go to programs for youth that they would lead. 1%. Now, how can they fight about that, right? So that's something that you could do at home, and I think that's a fantastic example of great local democracy.
If we have enough time, maybe we'll do another round at the end to close it out, because I think the stories are sort of what makes it. Okay, so this is totally different track, but we've seen a mixed response from the state and the ruling elite to various uprisings all over the world and here domestically as well, and it seems as though violence is escalating on the part of the state. So given that, how should we respond? And maybe you want to start, Ben? Sure. You this time?
So this is actually, we were scheming. I have to tell you, I planted this question. But I planted it because I want to know the answer. Something I've been thinking about a lot. And I have, one part of an answer. And it actually has to do with some of the work that I've been involved with the Liberty Tree Foundation. I had some early experiences with the environmental movement in the 1990s in which I came to see what could happen when the people with guns decided not to use them against you. So one instance in particular, we had this massive anti-mining fight in Wisconsin, which I made reference to earlier. Exxon was at the center of it. There were other mining companies, Rio Algom, RTZ, who wanted to open a huge metallic sulfide mining district in northern Wisconsin. And the tribes were at the front lines. There are 5 nations in Wisconsin with reservations and communities across the North Woods. And there were a lot of other folks who were involved too. Rural retirees, farmers. The AFL-CIO came out against mining in the state, a major step for them. Students and young people, folks like me at that time. And at one moment, members of a tribal warrior society, the Ogichida, they were members of the Anishinaabe Nation, better known as the Chippewa, discovered that a shipment of sulfuric acid was bound to go through their reservation. This is the Bad River Reservation in northern Wisconsin, headed to a mine in the UP, in the Upper Peninsula. And they set up an encampment on the tracks to prevent the train from going through. And that went on for a number of weeks before word started to get out to the southern part of the state. The media certainly wasn't covering it, but it started to become a big issue because the train couldn't come through. So the governor, Tommy Thompson at the time, decides that he is going to order the sheriff, who, by the way, is, as most of you probably know, a constitutional official who doesn't take orders from the governor, right, not responsible to the governor, to move in and arrest the members of this warrior society. And the sheriff refused, right? He refused. Now, that's great. But then the governor decided he was going to call in the FBI. And they held a press conference and said, I'm calling on the FBI because we have to have business and the trains have to move. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? A little Mussolini there. Then you know what the sheriff did? He put a squad car across the tracks. And that was a aha moment. So here's the thing, and I've seen that happen many other times. It happened in Wisconsin this past year, right, where the only police that the governor could count on were the state troopers because they're basically an arm of the Republican Party right now. But all the other police forces were loyal to the people they serve. We developed a strategy at Liberty Tree that looked at the question of the military in the United States and said, if we want to have a nonviolent revolution, we'd better make sure that it's nonviolent, meaning that we don't get shot, right? So what part of the United States military is most likely to take the side of the people? What part of the National Guard, the National Guard. And we researched the history of the National Guard, and then we ended up, some other people were thinking similar kinds of things in Vermont. It's always Wisconsin, Oregon, and Vermont, it seems like. And we connected with them, and we got legislation introduced in 13 states, including Oregon, that began to take back state control of the National Guard, right? So I guess what I could go into a much longer discourse on this, and it's a great campaign, and we're actually probably going to get it back up on its feet again. Obama taking office seemed to cool the heels of some of the Democratic sponsors. Now some of them are coming back to us and saying we still have a problem here of this legislation. But the point is that we have to have a strategy for convincing the people who are supposed to serve the people and who carry guns to not use them against the people.
I agree with that tactic and hope that we can do it effectively. I also know that violence will escalate globally and here, which means that part of what we need to prepare for is what that looks like. And not just what it looks like in a very abstract way, but what it looks like and might feel like if somebody shows up in your door bleeding and needs attention. We can't pretend like that might not happen. But to be able to face that reality in a way that doesn't undermine our ability to do solid work with each other is also important. It's also real whenever people talk about, change and revolution and making sure it's nonviolent. I appreciate earlier, Ben, that you named that the culture's already violent. Poverty is violent. Sexism is violence. Misogyny, white supremacy is violent, globally and in our lives. So we have to accept that and then figure out how do we create models that are different, that can work, that include the space where someone will put down the weapon and not use it against us. But we also have to acknowledge that we're in a culture that is not only violent as the culture, but is preparing us for either being suppressed or repressed. I mean, a lot of y'all don't watch conventional television. I love that our great singer, I just forgot her name, but Alice talked about, just watching the good TV in some ways. But if you did watch the other television, you'd think that you'd see that it's conditioning people to know how to act in court, know how to act when the police approach them. It's conditioning people to be in a state where the big F word, fascism, is the reality. And I want us to be real about that. So if I'm the first one that said the F word today, that's fine. I might not be the last one. So while we want to and absolutely embrace every opportunity to build effective relationships with those who have the choice to put down the arms and not use them against us, we also have to be able to do the work to make sure that in our communities, we are prepared for, emotionally prepared for, spiritually prepared for, politically prepared for an escalation of violence so that we don't turn on each other, so that that's really important, and so that we don't accept violence as a norm, as a consequence of what we're doing, and that it doesn't limit us from being aggressive and on the offensive for justice.
So I think also we are about to face some extreme backlash from the system. There are a lot of us in this room. There are a lot of people in this city. There are a lot of people in this country who are very unhappy with the way the housing system works, with the way the government works, with the amount of power that corporations wield. And we see that, we can tell that, we see that with Occupy, we see that with the way but there's also a group of people in this country who are becoming fabulously wealthy as a direct result of these things that we are all unhappy with. And while we are willing to fight to change them, there are people who are willing to fight really, really dirty in order to keep them just the way that they are. And I think as we become more and more effective, we're going to see a greater and greater backlash from the police, in particular, from the state and from the powers that be, the people who benefit now from the system the way that it is. Also want to say, I don't have the exact quote here, but want to capture hopefully some of the essence of it. Some of the things that you learn when theory about direct action, nonviolent direct action in this case, but all types of direct action, is some of the power of it. What is the power of it? How does the power of it work? And what it reveals about the target of your action. And so one of the important concepts of, in this case, nonviolent direct action, is that the use of violence in response to nonviolent action reveals the use of violence in the face of nonviolent direct action is directly in proportion to the injustice that the system is trying to maintain. If people are going to nonviolently register to vote and the police start beating them because they're going to register to vote, or people are trying to order a burger from a lunch counter and the police turn on water hoses in order to stop them from ordering a burger, it demonstrates something about the system, and it demonstrates something about the thing that they are trying to protect. And we are seeing that, we're beginning to see that right now with the response, with the escalated response of the police to our saying you shouldn't be kicking people out of their homes when they have nowhere else to go. This says something extremely profound about the amount of money that they're making right now off of this system. With that said, this violence is already starting to happen. I think we have two levels of responses to it that we must take. One is tactical, and the other is strategic. Tactically, in order to address or minimize the amount of violence, not to end it, but certainly to minimize the amount of violence that's going to be directed towards us, I think there's some simple things that we can and should do. One of the most important ones we have the ability to do now that we did not have the ability to do years back is to film the police when they are engaging and interacting with protesters, and then upload that film onto the internet and make sure that the whole world indeed is watching, and not rely on the mainstream media to reveal that, but for us to do that ourselves. The others, of course, is to have relationships with lawyers and have relationships. I think we're going to increasingly have to have direct relationships with doctors and other medical providers. I think it's going to be extremely important to have. That's on the tactical side. On the strategic side, I think there's a couple of things that we have to do. One is we have to become a lot clearer about what our objectives are. When people who are not here turn on their television and they see protesters out there getting beaten up by the police, they're going to ultimately ask, why is someone willing to go through this? Who could possibly be willing to march down and play knowing that they could potentially get beat up? Who would do that? And why are they doing it? And the answer to that question will determine if, after these incidents of police abuse happen, if our numbers will shrink because no one else is willing to do that, or if our numbers will grow because people are saying this cause is so right, this cause is so just, and these objectives are so good that we are willing to put ourselves in the line of fire in order to achieve them. And I don't want to talk too much specifics now, but just as we talking about the housing crisis, we have an opportunity here to go in a couple of different directions. We can go with something very simple and very basic. My concern, however, for example, we spent a lot of time talking about this. There's a lot of people doing foreclosure defenses to the extent that they're doing them, and they're saying they're doing them for principal reduction. I think that's important. I think that's good. I don't think it's enough. And more importantly, in response to this question here, I don't think we're going to be able to build a movement and get thousands of people to take to the streets and stand up to riot police and say, I'm here to fight for someone getting someone $50,000 knocked off of their mortgage. We're not going to be able to build a movement based on principal reduction. We're going to have to build a movement based on elevating housing to the level of a human right. That's what we're going to build a movement off of. And I assert that we can, people would be willing to face those brutal conditions if they knew that at the end of that, every human being would have decent housing that they could afford. And then the second strategic thing that I think we need to do is we need to build a holistic movement. Not build a single organization, but build a holistic movement. And the movement is going to have multiple parts. And there's going to have to be one part of the movement that is going to continuously, in the face of escalating violence, is going to have to return with escalating actions on our side. That's going to be an integral part, but that cannot be the only part of the movement. We have to have other parts of the movement that are happening at the same time and flanking, really, the system whose only response is going to be violence. We're going to have multiple responses. And in order to do that, we have to build a holistic movement, not just a singular organization.
Are you sure that question was your idea, Ben? Because I feel like Max knew exactly what to say. So in the context of where we are now, should we be talking about reform or revolution? And is there a difference in your mind?
Yay, I get to start this one. I like this one. Because I get to say the answer's both. But first, I want to invite y'all for a second, and this has a lot to do with a lot of people. But if you're writing or if there's something in your hands, if you're willing to indulge me for like 120 seconds, I'd say 90 seconds, but I think it'll take longer. So if you put everything down and kind of sit for a second with your feet on the ground and your spine kind of straight, and you don't have to close your eyes or get really groovy, but if you would, for a second, kind of inhale and exhale slower than you inhale. Just relax. Inhale slowly, exhale slower. Continue doing that. Inhale slowly, exhale slower. And I really want you to think about, what do you see when I say justice? What do you see when I say justice? How is housing when I say justice? What does the river look like when I say justice? How do the trees feel when I say justice? How do you stay healthy when I say justice? How's your garden? Where do you get your food when I say justice? Okay, so you can open your eyes again. Thank you. I want to say that because what you saw is revolution. To get where I don't even need to know what it is. But for us to get there, given what corporations are doing now, that's revolution. Now, between today and when we get there, and let's hope it's not 7 generations, but it might be, between now and when we get there, all that other stuff, that's reform. That's why it's both. Because for me, I'm not going to be able to shut down a public school next year or even 5 years from now, not shut it down. We might be able in 5 years to change how the budget is spent, right? In the meantime, though, if I want someone in my community who's a grammar school student or a high school student to have a full and comprehensive education that I define as full comprehensive education, that means somebody's got to be doing some after school work with them. That means people like us. So can you imagine, and this is my reform piece, one instance of a piece of reform. Once a week, maybe you can't afford it once a week, maybe you start with once a month. Some collective or coalition of folks has in a community where you know the school is deficit, we won't even deal with why, a night where the whole family comes, you have dinner, mom and grandma and uncles and aunts, whoever the parents are, go over here, and for 2 or 3 hours, they're involved in something that's about educating them and changing their life in a better way, whether it's how you keep your house, how you build new houses, how you have a garden so you feed yourself without poison. And in the meantime, over here, their students and their kids are participating in something where they're learning, here's what your real history is. Here's why you are brilliant people. Here's other ways that you can think about education that aren't what you're getting every day in school. That's just one piece of what reform can look like. That piece fits in with our healthcare system, with our housing system. We create the options and we use those other alternatives as we take control of what's now not working for us as we're part of the revolution. All right.
I like that vision. So I used to say that the problem with the left, which is another one of those words that I don't think has come up here yet, But having grown up in Madison, Wisconsin largely, I grew up in the left, right? Was that at the time that I, again, came of age politically, it was very focused on the J word, on the question of justice. It was so focused on justice that the P word, power, wasn't really part of its lexicon anymore. That's the way it seemed to me, and I think that's fairly accurate. That you saw that the progressive movement, I'll use that word instead, the progressive movement was very focused on very limited redistributionist demands, right? And stayed away from demanding power. And so I began to talk about the need for what I call democratic demands, right? To have demands for reforms that redistribute not just wealth or sets of goodies, right? And this is my own ignorance to a certain extent that I framed it that way, right? But that redistributed power so that people actually had a say in governance, so that instead of simply going to the chancellor and saying, please don't raise our tuition so much, or maybe making a more radical demand and saying, we need a tuition freeze, or making a still more radical demand and say, we demand abolition of tuition. You go to the chancellor and you say, we don't recognize your authority. We want a popular council, and we're instituting that council, right? I mean, we did that with the Board of Regents. I mean, we were, some young, I won't use the word punk, but I guess I just did. We went to the Board of Regents meeting. We elected our own regent. We said, well, we should have region elections, so we're going to elect our own regent, and we elected him. Somebody actually ran against our own candidate. This guy just showed up. We had a debate. He beat all the other candidates. He was down. We went to the next Board of Regents meeting, sat right down with his nameplate, and they left rather than be confronted with that challenge to their authority. So, I guess in time I've come to recognize, as I've had to deal with things like student debt and housing and healthcare and other things that most people who are white and from a middle class background in their 20s haven't dealt with yet, that justice demands are oftentimes democracy demands too, right? So it's more complicated. It's become more complicated for me, and I can't draw those neat lines. When does fighting for a living wage, something we got very early on, move from being something that is redistributionist and more limited to something that is actually empowering and allows people to have more time to participate and to not be so much under the thumb, right, of their employer? I don't know. What I will say is this, I'll just end with this. I think it's really essential that we keep that question of power at the center of everything that we do. That we always ask ourselves the question of whether this particular demand that we're opposing, this particular goal that we are struggling for, will lead us towards more democracy, right? More popular participation, more people joining the fray, right? So that the movement grows, becomes more aggressive, gets closer to that revolution, right? Or whether it is something that can be accepted by the powers that be. You can win, and then people go home, right? So, I was tempted to say, yeah, it's both, reform and revolution, it's both. But the point being that those reforms that we should be fighting for, and sometimes in the international left they call these non-reformist reforms, they are reforms that lead toward the growth of the movement becoming more assertive, more people joining it, and more popular empowerment. And that sort of closes the loop.
So let me start off by saying I agree with and appreciate George's point that this is not a complete dichotomy where it's not one or the other, that there is some kind of continuum, and sometimes things happen in order, not necessarily one or the other. In terms of what I think the question meant, in terms of which direction we're going in a fundamental way, this is the kind of answer that changes from one period of time to another. And there may be a correct answer when the question is asked one day, and that correct answer changes when the question is asked another day. So I think we think of social movements, and we want to think of social movements as things that should always be going and should always be moving, and why aren't we doing today what we're doing in the 50s and 60s? And one of the most obvious reasons, of course, if we were engaged in the same kind of high-level movement building over the course of decades without stop, we'd be exhausted. And we're exhausted now when we've just done 6 months of Occupy. But we'd be exhausted. But also, history doesn't move that way, and societies don't move that way. Social movements ebb and they flow. Sometimes we are ebbing, and we're going the 50s and 60s. We were on the flow. We were moving. We were moving agendas. We were advancing rights. We were doing all kinds of things. And then we were hit hard with a white backlash and with the Reagan administration, with all kinds of things. And we were in an ebb. We were rolling back. And that's the way movements happen. We move forward, and then we move backwards. And even our language or the strategies and tactics that we employ during an ebb changes from those that we do during a flow. I think you're exactly right when we talk about the way we framed things or talked about things. We didn't talk about building power. When the power of the right wing is growing, that's not the time that we talk about building power. That's the time we say, justice, justice, please give us justice. Right. And our language then starts to adapt to what time it is, whether we're in an ebb or flow. We, right now, or for many years, we've been talking about resistance. We're resisting this, we're resisting that. And resistance became, during an ebb, the most important thing, the most valiant thing we could do. Now, I think we are on a cusp of a change here, and we're moving from the oceans ebbing to the oceans getting ready to make a huge surge, a huge flow. And that means that the answer to that question, while it would have made total and complete sense in the 70s, probably would be answered in the 70s and certainly during the 80s, makes an entirely different, we have to apply an entirely different analysis to where we are right here and right now. There were organizations started, for example, I found out, did some research on, because I was working with NPA, National People's Action, one of the largest grassroots organizations in the United States. They might be the largest now that Acorn is gone. They were started in the late 1970s. They have never, up until a couple weeks ago, they had never, since they were founded in the 1970s, engaged in a civil disobedience action that resulted in arrest. Biggest organization in the United States never did that. Why was that? Because when they were started in the 1970s, it was started by leftists who were trying to figure out a way of creating an organization that would fight for justice but would not result in their people being murdered, just like people got murdered at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s. It was a perfect organization to create at that time. And this organization has gone since the 1972 or 73, has gone all this time and never done an arrest action. And last year, they asked for training on how to do civil disobedience arrest action, and they helped lead this 99% spring training, which is supposed to be teaching 100,000 people on how to engage in civil disobedience. This is a huge shift because the correct answer in 1972 and 1973 is not the correct answer in 2011 and in 2012. So there's huge and important work that has to be done in both periods, but the work that we have to do now is entirely different than the work that we had to do then. Where the language for the past 20 years has been the language of resistance, and the most important thing you can do during a time of resistance is to resist, we're no longer in a time of resistance. We're moving now in a time of advancement. And resisting in a time of advancement is not good enough. We need to be moving towards not just trying to hold the space that we've fought so hard for and make sure that the right doesn't take some of the rights that we had, and we need to be thinking about what rights can we gain as of this period, not just what rights we can hold on to.
You get us like a couple minutes, at most.
One piece I wanted to kind of add on that, and fantastic responses there, and exactly advancement is what we want to do. But I want to encourage y'all to think too about, in addition to advancement, to ask for all of it. One of the problems that happens in terms of, and why I think I use the word revolution, is that often, and when we talk about progressives or liberals or whatever, left, it's often what's the word? Pragmatic. Oh God, I hate that word, right? So that's why I asked you to close your eyes and envision what justice looks like, because when we answer intellectually, when we use just that part of our brain that's been conditioned to think a certain way, we'll start thinking about what makes the most sense and what fits the time. And instead of what do we really need? What do we really need? We need all of it. We need capital to be destroyed and for people to create options that work and respect them. We need all of it.
So we have 15 minutes left, but I don't want to ditch either one of these questions, so I'm going to trust you. And Stan is trusting me. So right now, what should be the role, if anything, of electoral politics?
So I don't want to speak too broadly here, but for Take Back the Land, we have not and have no intention on engaging in electoral politics. While we think certainly that is an important tool to have in the toolbox, and I have personally been involved in having spent many years in Miami, where all kinds of voter fraud takes place, and things have worked on voters' rights, the right to vote for ex-felons and for others. Having worked on that, I don't think that's how we're going to solve a problem. And there's an old movement saying that if voting worked, they would have made it illegal. I think that there are some things which can be accomplished through voting, and where those things that can be accomplished, then that should be done. I don't think we're going to see the majority of our victories come through voting. We're going to see the elected officials respond to the amount of power that we're able to build at this particular point in time, not the other way around. And I think when we think about voting first, we put the cart in front of the horse. Particularly in this time that we now have chances to advance very, very quickly, we're only going to slow ourselves down by psychologically depending on someone who we put into office solving all the problems for us. And I think we've just seen how that cripples the growing of a movement here.
Or maybe that was Emma Goldman, actually. I was thinking it would be strange for Debs to say that since he ran for office. I agree. Most of the work that I do is not in the electoral arena. That said, for whatever reason, I keep on finding myself drawn back into it. We have these things that are called election years, and one thing that I found over the years, it's very difficult to do much other types of organizing in election years that don't relate to elections somehow. So here's some of the ways in which I've chosen to relate to elections in my work. In 2000, there was this thing that happened in your former state of Florida, right? And after that happened, and seeing the way in which it went down, in which the Congressional Black Caucus was betrayed by the leadership of the Democratic Party and by Vice President Gore, it occurred to a lot of people, probably, not just a few of us, that we might see a repeat, and that it might be a good idea to get ready for the next time around. So in 2000, there was in Tallahassee, there was a project called Democracy Summer that took place. I think, were you there, George? Yeah, I think so. We worked on so many things together. David was involved in organizing that in the back, and we said we better start to develop something that's independent of the party system so that people can fight for voting rights and protect against election fraud and not be dependent and do it on our own, right, and not ask for permission. And networks were built. Fast forward to 2004. Trainings were held, networks were built, relationships were built. A lot of those relationships still exist. Fast forward to 2004. That was the year that I started the Liberty Tree Foundation. And our first project was something that became known as No Stolen Elections, right? And what we did was we pulled together this same network. David and George and a lot of other folks around the country who'd been working together on various issues for many years. And we said, we'd better get ready in case there's a repeat of Florida 2000. So we put together a pledge of action. And it was just 27,000 people who signed on to it, right? At the time, that seemed like a lot. Now our appetites are bigger, right? But 27,000 people said, if there is a repeat of Florida 2000, we will respond. And we came up with a strategy and a game plan. And because David Cobb was the Green Party presidential candidate, he had legal standing to put that plan into action, right? David filed for the recount in Ohio because John Kerry wouldn't, right? David went to the Libertarian Party candidate and said, will you join me in this? So it's not just a progressive thing. And to his credit, Michael Badnarik joined the Green Party, joined David Cobb in filing for the recount. And then with no stolen elections, we mobilized those 27,000 people to support the recount in Ohio. That is why there was a recount in Ohio, right? It's because we built an independent base to protect the right to vote, which is sacred. So that is That is something which I think is an effective and important means for engaging in elections, right? We repeated it in 2008. It's little known that we actually had over 60 cities around this country that actually had what we called voter assemblies the day after the election. People actually met, even though the election wasn't even close, right? So we were ready in case there was a repeat, and we're gearing up for 2012, okay? That's one thing. The second thing, and I'll make this quicker, I think that there is a role for independent politics in elections, right? And I have seen that in practice. Greens and others who serve in local government around the country are the first ones, are always the first ones to offer resolutions against the Patriot Act. Those were Green city councilors and mayors who initiated that, and they reached out to Democrats and Republicans and Libertarians and Independents to join them. Greens were the first ones to author resolutions against the Afghanistan war, against the Iraq war. Greens were the first ones to author municipal minimum wage laws, municipal living wage laws, municipal sick leave laws, right? Public power, having municipal control over your utility, right? So I think that there are places in our electoral system where there is space for us to elect ourselves. People like this green over here, Caitlin Saposi-Belknap, who serves on Water Commission?
Water Board.
Water Board. It's different in different parts of the country, right? And they become allies in office. I could go on longer, but I won't, so I'll stop there.
I know you've got another question, so instead of my answering, I'll go to the other.
All right, so the last question is, what needs to be done that isn't being done?
Oh, great.
That was another one of my questions.
Way to take one for the team, George.
Oh my God, Harold. Okay. Wow. Okay. I think there's a long list, and we can't do the long list. I think more than anything else, for us to give each other and ourselves a break. This is the rest of your life. You know what I'm saying? We have to take ourselves seriously. We have to consistently do the work to dismantle oppression, see our privilege, use it strategically, build effective relationships and coalitions with people so that we have a movement that is transferable to the issue and the moment. That's a lot of work. And there's a way that some of us are so deliberate and driven and in many ways attached in that sort of clenched fist way that we don't breathe enough that we can take someone else's hand, and then we've got a couple of other people to help us do the work.
We don't have a lot of time, yeah. This was another one of those questions that I want the answer to, so I'll make my response briefer this time. I think that what isn't being done enough of is implementing long-term strategy. So I'm giving almost a very different quality answer, although I know that George totally agrees because she said this earlier in one of her responses, and I'm just going to echo it. I think we need long-term strategy. We need to think not only what we're going to be doing next month and the month after that and next year, but where does this go in 5 years and in 10 years and in 15 years, and where are we going to be in 20 years? And we need to have that strategy discussion on an ongoing basis with many people. So I described the democracy convention that we had in Madison, Wisconsin this past year. That's part of what that was about, was to engage a lot of people who were actively involved in the work, right? This is not an academic conference at all. Who are actively involved in the work of organizing in their communities and in their industries and so on, to get together and figure out, well, how are we going to advance the movement for economic democracy? How are we going to advance democratizing education? How are we going to democratize defense, which is something that so-called progressives used to think about. They used to think about that question, and then they would act on it. I don't remember if I mentioned this earlier or not. I think maybe I did, but I'll just repeat it for those who missed it. We came within 12 votes in Congress of the war referendum amendment becoming part of our Constitution, an amendment that would have given the people the power to declare war, not Congress, right? That's how progressives earned the name progressive, because they had a strategy for progress. So that's the one thing I would like to see change. I will say that it is changing. I see a lot more strategy being implemented and a lot more long-term thinking. So I think maybe we're getting, we're getting the right to call ourselves progressives again, among many other things.
So first of all, I agree and appreciate both of those items and wholly endorse them. Let me just say one quick thing about organizing. So people throw around the term organizing. I just want to say I can't give a full definition right now for it. I'm not sure I can think of it right now, but organizing doesn't just mean people showing up at the same place at the same time and being at a protest. That's mobilizing, but that's not organizing. Organizing is people getting together for weekly meetings, not just saying, okay, everyone who agrees on this, go to this side of the room, everyone who agrees on that, go, but struggling with people on a long-term basis to get them to agree on a particular political platform or agenda or way of thinking, changing people's minds through an ongoing political education process. And we see a lot of community organizing happening in some low-income communities of color around gentrification, now around the housing crisis, right? So I just want to be clear about what I mean by organizing. One thing I don't think that's happening enough and needs to happen quick, fast, in a hurry before we get too far down this road, is organizing in white communities. We have huge numbers right now, because of this economic crisis, of middle class or formerly middle class whites who are impacted by this economic crisis and who are mad about the economic crisis and are showing up in protests, which is huge, showing up in protests about the economic crisis. But there's not a huge effort being made to systematically develop an analysis of what the crisis is, how we fight the crisis, and how we root out racism and patriarchy inside of the solutions that we're developing towards the crisis. In the 1950s and 60s in the civil rights movements, there were some strategic decisions were made where there were training camps that happened all around the country to teach people how to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience. And you had large numbers of whites going into black communities and training us on how to stand and lay down and deal with white people punching us while we were protesting, right? So you had huge numbers of white organizers going to black communities and teaching us how to accept blows from racist white people. Someone should have at some point said, our time would probably be better spent, instead of teaching black people how to accept punches from white people, going and organizing the white community and teaching them how to stop punching black people. I think there's a huge opportunity right now for us to significantly transform this society. And a big concern that I have is that there's going to be some kind of deal made or some kind of offer made where the system will be like, okay, we're about to lose everything, we need to make some deal. They're going to make a deal which will benefit a large number of whites, but would not necessarily benefit a large number of people of color, or would work to the benefit of whites but could be extremely xenophobic, for example, and that the large numbers of whites would love and embrace this and would effectively sell out the movement in order to maintain white privilege. We have to avoid this, and the way we're going to do that is by organizing white communities.
Wait a minute. We get one more minute. I just have to say, if you want to end something on time, you give the mic to Caitlin. You start late, you end on time. And I just have to, can I just tell one quick story of inspiration? Because that wasn't fair. We started late, and now we're ending on time. So I did just want to tell you all one thing, because it's a big room, and I haven't had a chance to clap about this with anybody. So in Vermont, just yesterday, we mentioned Vermont, right? In Vermont, just yesterday, even though there were repeated attempts over and over again on the part of other legislators, on the part of other organizations, to water it down and make it just about Citizens United, the Vermont legislature voted yesterday, and they had already voted in the Senate last week, to be the first state to resoundingly call for a constitutional amendment to not just overturn Citizens United, but actually to abolish corporate personhood and make it so that money is not speech in the Constitution. So, with that, and I believe it was 4 Republicans voted for that as well in the State House. And 5 Democrats voted against it. So with that, I will turn the microphone back to Stan. And actually, are we going to give them another round of applause?
Yes, let's give our panelists another round of applause, please. That's right. And all of these panelists will be back tomorrow doing organizing trainings with their areas of emphasis. So be back tomorrow. Look at that schedule to get to see them again. I also want to say, we are streaming on the World Wide Web. We've had over 2,000 hits today on the World Wide Web for this event.